What if I told you that one of the most compelling leadership stories in human history has been hiding in plain sight in your Bible? The Book of Nehemiah isn't just another Old Testament narrative about rebuilding walls. It's a masterclass in crisis management, political strategy, and transformational leadership that reads like a modern-day thriller. Every CEO, politician, and project manager should study this ancient text because Nehemiah accomplished something that seems impossible by today's standards. He rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem in just 52 days, while facing enemies on every side, internal sabotage, and seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Most people think they know the story of Nehemiah. They picture a religious man who prayed a lot and somehow convinced people to stack some stones. But that's not even close to the full picture. Nehemiah was actually the most powerful non-royal person in the Persian Empire, serving as the personal cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, a position that made him essentially the chief of staff to the most powerful ruler on earth. When he heard that his ancestral city of Jerusalem lay in ruins with broken walls and burned gates, he didn't just feel sad and pray about it. He developed a sophisticated political and military strategy that would make modern strategists take notes. The year was 445 BCE, and the Persian Empire stretched from India to Ethiopia, controlling virtually the entire known world. Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Babylonians over 140 years earlier, and although some Jews had returned from exile to rebuild the temple, the city itself remained defenseless. Without walls, Jerusalem was basically a collection of buildings, with no protection from bandits, raiders, or hostile neighbors. It was like trying to run a business with no security system, no locks on the doors, and a neon sign advertising your vulnerability. The situation was so dire that the few people living there were constantly under threat, and the city's population was declining rapidly. But here's what makes Nehemiah's story absolutely fascinating from a leadership perspective. He didn't rush into action. Despite his powerful position and his emotional connection to Jerusalem, he spent 4 months in prayer, fasting, and strategic planning before making his move. This wasn't procrastination, it was preparation. He was gathering intelligence, analyzing risks, and developing contingency plans. He understood that good intentions without good strategy lead to disaster, and that moving too quickly could destroy any chance of success. When Nehemiah finally approached King Artaxerxes with his request, he had already thought through every possible objection and prepared compelling responses. He didn't just ask for permission to go to Jerusalem, he requested official letters of safe passage, authorization to use timber from the king's forest, and a military escort for protection. Most remarkably, he asked for an indefinite leave of absence from his prestigious position, knowing he might never return to court. The king not only granted all these requests, but gave him more resources than he had asked for. This wasn't luck. It was the result of careful relationship building and strategic communication. The journey from Susa to Jerusalem took Nehemiah about 4 months, covering roughly 900 miles through hostile territory. But even when he arrived, he didn't immediately announce his mission or start rallying the troops. Instead, he spent 3 days quietly observing the situation, resting from his journey, and letting people get used to his presence. Then, on the 3rd night, he conducted a secret reconnaissance mission, riding around the city walls under cover of darkness to assess the damage firsthand. This covert operation revealed that the destruction was even worse than reported. In some places, the walls were so completely demolished that his horse couldn't even find a path through the rubble. This midnight survey wasn't just about gathering information, it was about building credibility. When Nehemiah finally called a meeting with the local leaders, he could speak with authority about specific problems and present concrete solutions. He didn't rely on second-hand reports or make grandiose promises based on wishful thinking. He had seen the situation with his own eyes and could articulate a realistic plan based on actual conditions. This kind of thorough preparation gave him instant credibility with people who had probably heard plenty of empty promises from well-meaning visitors. The way Nehemiah motivated the people to join his construction project reveals sophisticated understanding of human psychology. He didn't appeal to their patriotism or their religious duty. He appealed to their self-interest. He pointed out that they were living in disgrace and vulnerability, and that rebuilding the walls would restore their honor and security. He showed them the king's letters, proving he had official backing and resources. He shared his personal story of leaving a comfortable position to come help them, demonstrating his commitment. Most importantly, he presented a clear, achievable plan with specific assignments for different families and groups. The response was immediate and overwhelming. "Let us rise up and build." But Nehemiah knew that initial enthusiasm wouldn't be enough to sustain a massive construction project in the face of serious opposition. He organized the work with military precision, assigning each family or group responsibility for the section of wall nearest their own homes. This wasn't random, it was brilliant psychology. People would work harder and better when they were literally building protection for their own families. It also created natural accountability, because shoddy work on your section would endanger your own household. As soon as construction began, the opposition emerged. Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arab formed a hostile coalition determined to stop the project. These weren't random troublemakers. They were regional governors and power brokers who benefited from Jerusalem's weakness and saw a fortified city as a threat to their own influence and profits. They started with mockery and ridicule, publicly questioning whether the Jews had the skills, resources, or determination to complete such an ambitious project. When that didn't work, they escalated to threats of violence and began spreading rumors that Nehemiah was planning to rebel against the Persian king. Nehemiah's response to this opposition reveals masterful crisis leadership. He didn't ignore the threats or respond with empty bravado. Instead, he implemented a comprehensive security strategy while continuing construction. He armed the workers, organized them into defensive units, and established a communication system using trumpets to quickly mobilize forces in case of attack. Half the workers held weapons while the other half built, and they rotated responsibilities throughout the day. He also stationed guards at the most vulnerable points and required everyone to sleep within the city walls instead of returning to their homes in surrounding villages. But the external opposition was nothing compared to the internal crisis that nearly destroyed the project. As construction progressed, a severe economic crisis hit the community. Many families had mortgaged their fields and homes to buy food during a recent famine, and now they couldn't make their payments. Wealthy Jews were foreclosing on these properties and even forcing poor families to sell their children into slavery to pay their debts. The construction workers were facing the choice between building walls and feeding their families, and morale was collapsing. This economic crisis presented Nehemiah with his greatest leadership challenge. He could have tried to ignore the problem and focus on construction, but he recognized that social injustice would destroy the project from within, even if they succeeded in keeping out external enemies. Instead, he called an immediate halt to construction and summoned all the nobles and officials for a public confrontation. In front of the entire community, he accused the wealthy of exploiting their own people and demanded immediate restitution. He even used his own example, pointing out that he and his servants had been lending money and grain without interest, and calling on others to follow his lead. The wealthy initially resisted, but Nehemiah's combination of moral authority, public pressure, and practical reasoning eventually convinced them to reverse their policies. They agreed to return foreclosed properties, cancel debts, and stop charging interest on loans to fellow Jews. Nehemiah made them swear a public oath to ensure compliance, and when some hesitated, he performed a dramatic gesture, shaking out his garment and declaring that God would shake out anyone who broke this promise. The combination of social pressure and religious symbolism proved effective, and the economic reforms were implemented immediately. This internal crisis and its resolution actually strengthened the project in the long run. By addressing the underlying social problems, Nehemiah created a more unified and motivated workforce. People were no longer working just to build walls. They were working to create a just and secure community. The wealthy learned that their own prosperity depended on the welfare of the entire community, while the poor gained confidence that their leaders would protect them from exploitation. This kind of transformational leadership goes far beyond project management. It builds the social capital necessary for long-term success. As the walls neared completion, the opposition became more desperate and dangerous. Sanballat and his allies tried to lure Nehemiah away from Jerusalem for a meeting that was clearly intended to be an assassination attempt. When he refused to leave the city, they hired a false prophet to trick him into hiding in the temple, which would have discredited him as a coward and violated religious law since he wasn't a priest. They even sent false reports to the Persian king, claiming that Nehemiah was planning rebellion and had hired prophets to declare him king of Judah. Nehemiah's response to these psychological warfare tactics demonstrates remarkable emotional intelligence and strategic thinking. He recognized each attempt for what it was, and refused to be drawn into traps that would compromise his mission or his integrity. He didn't waste time and energy responding to every accusation or threat. He stayed focused on the construction project while maintaining vigilance against real dangers. When the false prophet suggested he hide in the temple, Nehemiah immediately recognized the trap and responded with a powerful question: "Should a man like me flee?" His refusal to show fear or compromise his principles actually strengthened his position and exposed his enemy's desperation. The completion of the walls in just 52 days sent shockwaves throughout the region. Even Nehemiah's enemies recognized that this accomplishment was beyond normal human capability and attributed it to divine intervention. But the real miracle wasn't supernatural. It was the result of excellent leadership, careful planning, unified effort, and unwavering determination in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles. The speed of construction can be explained by several factors: the use of existing foundations and stones from previous structures, the large workforce organized efficiently, the high motivation of people working to protect their own homes, and the continuous work schedule with minimal breaks. However, Nehemiah understood that building walls was only the beginning of rebuilding a city. Physical security without social and spiritual renewal would create nothing more than a fortified ghost town. So he immediately shifted focus to populating Jerusalem and establishing sustainable governance structures. He organized a lottery system to bring people from surrounding villages into the city, ensuring adequate population density for defense and economic viability. He also worked with Ezra the scribe to restore religious education and observance, recognizing that shared values and identity were essential for long-term unity and stability. The dedication ceremony for the completed walls reveals Nehemiah's understanding of the importance of celebration and symbolism in building community spirit. He organized elaborate processions with choirs, musicians, and religious leaders, creating a memorable experience that would bind the community together and mark the transition from vulnerability to security. The celebration wasn't just about the walls. It was about the transformation of a defeated, scattered people into a unified, confident community capable of protecting itself and preserving its identity. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Nehemiah's leadership was his refusal to use his position for personal gain. As governor of Judah, he was entitled to a substantial salary and expense account paid by taxing the local population. Instead, he used his own resources to support his administration and even provided daily meals for 150 officials and visitors at his own expense. This wasn't just generosity, it was strategic leadership. By refusing to burden the people with additional taxes during a time of economic hardship, he maintained their support and demonstrated that their welfare was more important to him than his own comfort. After 12 years as governor, Nehemiah returned to Susa to resume his duties as the king's cupbearer. But when he came back to Jerusalem for a visit, he found that many of his reforms had been abandoned. The temple was being misused for storage by Tobiah, one of his former enemies who had gained influence through marriage connections. The Levites weren't receiving their proper support and had abandoned their religious duties to work in the fields. People were working on the Sabbath and intermarrying with foreign nations, compromising the religious and cultural identity he had worked to restore. Nehemiah's response to this backsliding reveals another dimension of his leadership character. He didn't throw up his hands in despair or blame the people for their unfaithfulness. Instead, he took immediate, decisive action to restore proper practices. He physically threw Tobiah's belongings out of the temple chambers, purified the rooms, and restored them to their proper use. He confronted the officials who had neglected their responsibilities and implemented new accountability measures. He even grabbed men by their hair and made them swear oaths when they tried to justify their compromises, showing that sometimes dramatic action is necessary to break through complacency and denial. The Book of Nehemiah ends abruptly with his prayer asking God to remember his good deeds, but the historical impact of his work extended far beyond his lifetime. The walls he built protected Jerusalem for centuries and provided the security necessary for the Jewish community to preserve their identity through successive foreign occupations. The social and religious reforms he implemented created a foundation for Jewish survival that would prove crucial during the Greek and Roman periods. Most importantly, his example of principled leadership in the face of overwhelming challenges provided a model that would inspire future generations facing their own seemingly impossible circumstances. What makes Nehemiah's story particularly relevant for modern leaders is how many of his challenges mirror contemporary issues. He dealt with budget constraints, hostile opposition, internal conflicts, security threats, economic inequality, corruption, and the constant pressure to compromise principles for short-term gains. His solutions weren't based on having unlimited resources or perfect conditions. They were based on clear vision, careful planning, excellent communication, unwavering integrity, and the ability to inspire others to work toward a common goal, even when success seemed impossible. The leadership principles demonstrated in Nehemiah's story are timeless and transferable to any context where someone must mobilize people to accomplish difficult goals in the face of serious obstacles. Whether you're leading a business transformation, managing a community development project, or trying to create positive change in any organization, Nehemiah's example provides a roadmap for turning vision into reality through strategic thinking, principled action, and persistent effort, even when the odds seem impossibly stacked against you.